Hey guys, and welcome to today's video. So in this one, I'm going to be talking to you about all the ways that 3D printing has well and truly got me back into miniature collecting and miniature painting. And there are so many reasons why, if you are in the market to get something like this, that personally, I think you should take the plunge and give it a go. So first up, let's talk about the Pros. So I've got the Elegoo Mars Pro, and I've got to say it's been a great little 3D printer. I didn't have too many issues setting it up, and I've printed off a whole load of different things. Now, the thing that drew me to 3D printing was the massive selection of different sculpts and different models and all the different patrons and everything that you could subscribe to. And that is one of the first pros of this. The selection is absolutely huge. You can pretty much find something that will suit every single creator out there. If you are looking to paint up some random space warriors, something from fantasy, something from, I guess, like a prop or a TV show that you've been watching, it pretty much exists and you're most likely going to be able to find it, print it up and paint it yourself. And that is one of the big draws for me. You're not just limited to one type of creator like Games Workshop, for example. You've got the freedom to choose what you want to print and customize it as well. As part of those sets as well, you don't have to sit there and go, you know what, I'm going to have to buy 20 warriors and then end up with loads of them wasted and maybe sell them or kind of look at my grey pile of shame. With this, if there's a set of 20, you can print just one or two of them. So you can print off your favourite ones and then you don't have that everlasting guilt of not painting stuff hanging over you. So that's a big win as well. Speaking of customization, if you're a dungeon master or if you're into your wargaming and stuff like that, there's been so many times where you'll see a model and you go, yeah, that's great, that will be my boss. But actually he comes in, he's only about yay big and the rest of your party is about yay big as well. Well, the great thing about 3D printing is you can change the scale. So if you want something bigger, you can take that little model that's yay big and you make him that big, or you can make him that big if you've got the printer size for it. You've got all sorts of customization options for these things. You can change it up, you can change the scale. Recently I've been doing a Barbarian Horde by Artisan Guild and I wanted to make a couple of those like giants, so I'm going to have some giant barbarians, and it's really easy to do within the settings and just change that up myself. The next reason why 3D printing really drew me into it and got me back into painting is that you get that whole thing of practice makes perfect. A lot of the times you're spending $20, $30 on a single unit that looks really cool and you get it from somewhere like Games Workshop and it shows up. You don't want to mess around with your paint schemes, so a lot of the times you'll stick with what you already know and what you're already good at. With 3D printing, you can print off a second or a third one if you want to without having to strip the paint, so you can practice on the first one, and if you don't like that paint style, you can switch it up to the next one. If you want to change your color scheme, you can do that. If you want to practice with something else, a completely different technique, you've got that ability to, because it doesn't really cost too much to print off a second model. So you can practice, and over again you get better and you try different paint styles and stuff like that. And I think that's something that's overlooked all too often. The other thing is, if you're impatient like me, it's relatively fast. It does come with things like cleaning up and stuff like that, and I'll get onto that in the cons, but ultimately, if you find a model and you want to buy it, you then have to have it shipped to you and wait all of that time. Well, if you're impatient, you have a 3D printer, you can literally get it onto your USB stick, plug it into your printer, and within a couple of hours, you can have your model there, ready to go, ready to print and build, and it's a really fast process. Like I said, it does come with its cons as well, and we'll get onto those, but right now we're on the pros list. And the next one is that actually in the long run, in my opinion anyway, it does save you money. There is a larger upfront cost to get into the hobby, but actually once you've got it, subscribing to different Patreon creators, it tends to give you so many different options in terms of what you print. There's some really good ones out there, and some of my favourites at the moment have been Highlands Miniatures and Artisan Guild, and with those you tend to subscribe and you get a full set for the month, and you get all sorts of different units, and it's great for building different regiments. If you're into wargaming, if you want to print off different things for Dungeons and Dragons, it's all there. And basically for like $10 a month, you get a hell of a lot of models for that. And even though you are saving that money, you don't necessarily lose that quality. And that's one of the things that I went into this hobby thinking, was that my 3D printer was going to print me off a couple of models. They'd be okay, but actually they would look awful in comparison to things from Games Workshop. But to be honest, there isn't too much of a noticeable loss. And actually, I'm using a relatively cheap and budget printer, and I can only dream of the things and the quality that I would get from a more expensive printer. The quality on these things is pretty damned fantastic, and the quality of the sculpts is amazing as well. So you know what, in terms of quality, it is really spot on right now. So that's a lot of the great reasons why, in my opinion, you should get into the hobby and get a 3D printer if you wanted to kind of ease yourself back into miniature painting, miniature collecting, and you want to tinker around with something like that. But it does also come with its cons, and there are a few that you need to consider. First up, it expensive up front. You've got to buy yourself the printer, but not only that, you've also got to buy all the resin. You've got to buy all the stuff to clean up with as well, so it's not quite as simple as just print and you know what, your model's ready to go. You've got to clean it with maybe some alcohol. You've got to make sure you have the gloves, the mask, and everything else that goes with it. So that's something worthwhile bearing in mind. There is a larger upfront cost that will be incurred with getting into 3D printing. Granted, how big that cost is depends on your budget and depends on what type of printer you go for, but it does all start to add up. And it does also become a little bit addictive. I can't tell you how many sculpts I have bought and never printed, and instead of having a grey pile of shame, I also just have this virtual pile of shame that I probably will never print those models, so it can get expensive in that way. The process of 3D printing is messy and hands-on. Now you can do things to limit this, and as you get used to the process, it does get easier to stop that mess from getting everywhere. But you've got all sorts of things that you need to learn, and there is a bit of a learning curve with it. In terms of things like your slicer settings, you've got to make sure you nail that down in terms of your printer and your resin. You've got to do all sorts of research. For me, I was fortunate enough that it was pretty much plug and play with my printer, but there are all sorts of horror stories that I've seen out there, and when things start to go wrong and you are new to this hobby, it can be quite hard to diagnose at first. In terms of it being messy, resin is not something that you want to get on your skin, you don't want to be breathing it in, and it can be a bit frustrating to get it all cleaned up. So you need to make sure that you have things like your gloves, your mask, somewhere that you're going to clean it, and everything else that comes with it. Even when you do get used to this process, it can still result in quite a lot of mess going everywhere. So again, it's something that you need to consider. There's a lot of wasted stuff that comes off with the supports. You need to make sure you get rid of those properly, and any of your cleaning materials, you've got to clean them as well and make sure that you're disposing of them correctly. So in terms of that, it does come with a lot more mess than just getting something on a sprue, cutting it off, and then slapping it together. One of the last things to talk about, and this is something that I'm hoping to iron out as I try different resins and different curing times and stuff like that, is that the models are more brittle than something like your Games Workshop models. If you drop one of these models and it is a smaller one with bits that are hanging off it, chances are they will break and snap right off. And that is absolutely something that people need to consider. If you're going to be playing a lot with children, or if your friends are a bit clumsy and stuff like that, some of these models are more likely to break than something else that you might buy elsewhere. So do bear that in mind. There are things that you can do to try and rectify it and make them stronger, but I'm still getting used to that, and fingers crossed I will nail it down. But it is definitely one of the downsides that needs considering. And last but not least, and this is kind of a pro as well, but it is addictive. I can't tell you, again, like I said, how many things that I've ended up buying and wanting to print off, and you can end up falling into that spiral because it's almost too accessible. You buy your model sculpt online, or you subscribe to a different Patreon creator or someone's monthly subscription. Next thing, you're printing off a whole load of models that are probably never going to get printed. Sometimes having that whole thing of having to buy something and wait for it to get shipped to you stops you from jumping in. But if you're like me and you just go a little bit crazy, it can get very addictive and more expensive because of that. So again, worthwhile bearing in mind depending on what your personality type's like, but you do you. So that's some of the pros and cons to consider when getting into 3D printing, especially for miniatures. But I have had a blast. Before I got into this, I was always looking at the Games Workshop website, wanting to get back into the hobby, but it always just seemed a little bit too expensive. I wasn't too sure what I wanted to get. If I saw a regiment that I liked a few units for, there were just loads that I just didn't want to paint, and I knew that I never would, and I would just never paint at all. Getting back into 3D printing has well and truly got me back hook, line and sinker. I've been printing, I've been painting, and having an absolute blast with it. So if you're someone like me, then maybe it's worthwhile considering. I absolutely love the hobby now, and I'm well and truly back into it. It's even got me buying more models from Games Workshop and other similar people. I hope you've enjoyed that video. If you have, hit the like and subscribe button. It really helps the channel to grow. If you've got any questions, throw them down in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer those, and I'll see you for the next video. Bye.